This is the first episode in which we have a guest. Before we jump into it, note that the interview was conducted remotely, so there may be some variation in quality.
Welcome to the Assurance Show. This podcast is for internal auditors and performance auditors. We discuss risk and data-focused ideas that are relevant to assurance professionals. Your hosts are Connor McGarity and Yusuf Mullah.
Today we've got Josam Watson. Josam, thanks for joining us. Josam is the Chief Risk Officer of Tyme Global. We met quite a few years ago when you were at a banking institution in Australia, and then subsequently Chief Audit Officer for a large credit union here. I'm not going to give too much of an introduction. I'll let you do that for yourself.
Thanks, Yusuf, and thanks, Connor. I'm from Zimbabwe, and I'm proudly Zimbabwean, even though my country is not going through one of the best moments in history. I also pride myself for being Australian, my adopted country. In terms of the professional background, many people, when they see me in risk or in my previous roles in internal audit, they think that I've been an audit or governance for a long time, or that's all my career. But I started my career in retail banking as a teller, then worked in the back office operations dealing with investments. My first professional qualification was a banking qualification. So I completed an Institute of Bankers course in my first year of working direct from high school. Banking was one of those areas which was viewed with prestige. And my family were very happy when they saw that my first job after leaving high school was in banking. All they could think was I would just go in and grab some money without actually knowing how this works. The banks create money. My career from there spanned retail banking, consulting services, investment banking, and now risk and governance. But I've been part of the team that was doing the business as well as consulting and working for Deloitte and EY. I see a lot of opportunities to redefine risk management. It's one of the few professions where standardized training doesn't exist. If you're a lawyer, you go through articles of clerkship and get mentored by a lawyer and then qualify through the bar. If you're a doctor, you do your degree, then housemanship and become a qualified doctor. If you're a pilot, you go through the same thing. But here we are, a profession that is supposed to be helping organizations protect value, create value, but you find sporadic processes. Most risk professionals have been there by accident. Some because they were legal practitioners and somebody decided that law is very close to compliance. So therefore, our risk professional has to be a lawyer. And then you've got some chartered accountants, and then by accident, because they talk jargon around controls, so we'll make them chief risk officers. So there's a lot to do to have people come through this profession through formal structured programs so that they can be better practitioners. I'm not advocating a program similar to being a doctor, but there is an opportunity to uplift the standard and the quality of risk professionals coming in.
Okay, diversifying away from lawyers and accountants just because they happen to know the language.
Risk management is an art by and large, but also it requires a lot of science. The importance in the organization and the cost pressures it would put in an organization, if it's not run very well, will be far-reaching. I have been privileged enough to have worked in Africa, spent some time in the UK, in Europe, Australia, and now in Asia in a regional role that looks after many countries. In all these exposures, the variability that you see in risk management is something else. And I am fortunate that I work in a financial technology company, fintech. There's no requirement for us because we are not a regulated entity and we are not operating here in Hong Kong as a banking institution. But my CEO recognizes the value of risk. And when he tapped me for this role, we had a very candid discussion on why he wanted a risk professional. In our regular catch-ups, we would talk about he wants his chief risk officer to be a thinker, someone who has got space to think and reflect, not being too involved, but not being detached, so that he'll be able to advise, help accelerate the business. I see my CEO as a visionary who sees the value of risk in a way that I haven't seen before. With that level of responsibility, it takes quite a lot to be very measured and do things that aid in creating value for the organization and protecting the organization when you need to.
You spoke about getting into banking and then slowly moving into consulting and accounting firms and then getting back into banking. Now, of course, you are Chief Risk Officer of a global fintech. Before this, you were within internal audit teams. What is it that got you into auditing in the first place?
I didn't have the privilege of going to university and going through university life and growing up a little bit. It meant that I was one of the youngest people in our division. I was ridiculed for being the youngest. So I used to be a source of amusement for my more senior colleagues. Our head office was in a very exclusive suburb in Harare, very, very exclusive, and we were living in the township, high-density areas. The only way we would be able to get to those areas where there was no public transport is a staff bus. We used to wake up early in the morning so that we catch it. And then after a very hard day's work, you're so exhausted, you're not used to the rigor of working. And you're in a pressure where everyone there is seasoned, 15, 20, 30 years experience, and you're there as a freshman. And going back home, I vividly remember one time when I fell asleep on the bus and I only woke up out of hearing a lot of laughter and saying, hey, why do we employ young kids? We're exhausting them. We should be letting them stay at home. So anyway, just the sense of it is just talks about how young I was and how I felt that I wasn't in my environment and I didn't have connections my age. But as I continued to do my work, I realized that I had more to learn and more to offer. In my early days, I would do overtime almost every day so that I would catch up on the work. But after I got the hang of it, in the first 15 days of the month, I'll be done with my work. I realized that I had capacity to do more. I finished my banker's diploma, so much time at my disposal. And that's when I thought I would take the opportunity to go to university. I decided on Bachelor of Accounting Science. It sounded sexy. And a friend of mine came as well to the institution and they were doing auditing. He indicated that that was the best course for me to do. And I wanted to carry a briefcase like he was carrying. And it was a source of pride. You'd say, what is in that briefcase? The only thing I didn't know that the briefcase had a few sandwiches.
Yeah.
and nothing else.
2 pens and 2 wrap sandwiches, yeah.
Yes.
Maybe an apple.
And an apple is for the healthy ones. I spoke to this friend of mine and then he encouraged me that the BCom was obviously a very good way to go. So I then started studying accounting via distance education with the University of South Africa. And that course is as pure as it gets for young accountants. Early on, I got this audit learning. It's one of those first few units that you do. And it was quite exciting. But because I had a lot of time, I accelerated my learning. After completing my first year, I could see that I was learning something, but I was unable to apply it on a day-to-day basis. So an opportunity had to be found where I can do the study and implement it. I then joined an accounting firm called Barber Robb & O'Connor, which was part of Arthur Andersen. You know about the Andersen scandal. So our firm was bought by EY. So I then continued to do articles at Ernst & Young. During that time, Ernst & Young had a number of streams for young accountants. The external audit stream, the internal audit stream, and the accounting stream, depending on which areas you were recruited in, would determine which stream you would go in. I was in the external audit one, but because of my prior banking experience, partners were running internal audit and risk consulting, starting to bring me into the internal audit stream. For the duration of my training, I ended up spending almost 50% in external audit and 50% in internal audit and risk consulting. I found myself gravitating towards internal audit as I could see that there was more influence.
And more than one risk.
Yes, more than one risk. So this area around risk consulting and internal audit was quite an eye-opener for me because I had a few career-defining experiences or mindset-defining. I was involved in a review for a bank that was going through a curatorship. I saw that the bank had failed effectively and it was being managed by the prudential regulator so that you protect depositors' money.
Yep.
So first-hand experience of seeing a bank going down and was involved in reviewing the risk systems, the control systems. When I left EY, I worked in one of the fastest growing banks in the country. It was started by two visionaries who were working for a bigger bank. It was the fastest growth I have ever seen. Very good in terms of brand, very good in terms of customer service. Their strategy was spot on and their leadership was incredible. But one thing that didn't catch up with all the growth was the governance and risk management capabilities. As an auditor in that institution, seeing things that led to the fall of that bank stayed with me in every subsequent role.
It makes you take your job very seriously because you've seen the consequences of not having it in place.
It's actually validated with some of the studies that have been done in corporate failures. There's a trend in organizations failing or where you have got these big scandals. The trend is, number one, something would be known. So the real cause would be known. Number two, it would have been escalated one way or the other. And then number three, it would have been discussed, but no sufficient action to address the root cause. All the scandals you have seen in Australia, you are looking at the FX scandal, you look at AML, those external independent reports done post the event. In each one of those things will be known and escalated and discussed, but not sufficient action has been done to address the root cause. Seeing it firsthand happening in an organization where I was an audit lead of a matter that was picked up and then 1 year down the line caused the collapse was something else. I talk to young and upcoming risk professionals or auditors. Things that you see are not small things. You see quite a lot of things, and the matter is how you actually go about craft the message so that people who are dealing with several priorities would prioritize what you're saying is a problem.
That's an important point, right? There's obviously lots of different priorities, as you say, lots of different risks and issues that are brought up or opportunities that are identified. How do you, or how have you, through your auditing career and now subsequently your risk career, but primarily through your auditing career, how do you differentiate between what is and isn't important to raise?
That's a very difficult question. If I had a good answer, I would have written a book. It is the single biggest question for an internal audit professional. If you step back a little bit, how many reviews a typical internal audit function in a smaller bank or in a bigger bank? How many do they do? If you're talking about a bigger bank, they'll run in their hundreds. And for smaller banks, it can be 20 as an example, or it can be 10. And how many controls across those reviews do you touch? You touch hundreds and thousands of controls.
Yep.
How many do you see having issues? Quite a lot. You're talking about a number of permutations. Where you bring the best of what internal audit can do is where you have a very good understanding of the key business value drivers and link to what you're doing to the strategy would help you calibrate. But there's no silver bullet and there's no formula to this. Experience, judgment, and being an internal auditor who's attuned to the business and who thinks like a business leader. The worst thing you can do as an internal auditor is to think that you know everything and you are going to tell people what to do. If you are in tune with what the business is doing, it will be easier for you to get two-way communication with senior leaders in a way that is more collaborative rather than more I got you aspect. I've realized that some of the best audit findings I've raised, I'm calling them best because the interaction between me as an auditor and the business leader who's responsible for the area that I was looking at was positive. And looking at this as our joint problem, where both of you are looking at an issue or a problem as a problem that you both own, internal audit and the business, you are more measured in how you rate the importance of it.
Yeah, the right level of the organization, because typically more junior people would then focus on the execution than on ownership of those issues.
Yes, but I've got something to the contrary as well. One of the examples I have was I was dealing with a junior person. And it was quite insightful, where you actually take time, listen to what they're saying, and work through to get a more complete picture. The temptation is to rush and be more focused on, I'm going to deliver this audit. We have to issue an audit committee is coming. We need to complete this. That's one of the service you can do as an internal auditor. If there is a pertinent issue and it's feeling and sounding like a pertinent issue, sometimes it's worth it taking more time to understand and go through the value chain and see the interrelationships. You learn more, and you actually find that sometimes what you are considering a problem is not actually a problem, but the real problem is hidden and you find it by accident.
If you enjoy listening to this podcast as much as we enjoy recording it, tell a friend or rate us on iTunes. If you have any suggestions, reach out to us at datainaudit.com. Now, back to the conversation.
Josam, you mentioned there that some of the best outcomes you've been involved in, both as a risk and internal audit professional during your career, has been where your teams have been able to influence decisions in the business, and that's because you took a more collaborative approach. Should internal audit teams and risk teams be carving out more time every year as part of their work so that they do have that better understanding of the business?
Yeah, I agree. The challenge that most internal audit functions have is high turnover. And the tenure of internal auditors would be less than 3 years. That is not sufficient time for an internal auditor to learn about the organization's processes, culture, strategy, and value drivers. It's not enough. As internal audit professionals or risk professionals, we play the independence card. And we say we are independent, so we don't want to seem to be involved more. It's a disservice, and unfortunately, our representative bodies have been preaching a lot about independence and using it as one of the cornerstones. A very good internal audit function doesn't even use the word independence, and they do not actively promote that. They know that it's inherent in the way you conduct yourself, but you do not consciously say, if I do this, I'm going to be seen as less independent, because at the end of the day, what you're there for is to protect value and create value in the organization. And your objectives are not different to the frontline managers. If you see that there is a difference in objective between your frontline managers or your business managers and internal audit, then there's something that is fundamentally wrong with either the internal audit function or the frontline manager. And that shouldn't be the case. I remember my time at CUA, and the CEO there, I think, is one of the greatest leaders. We used to have chats about the independent story of internal audit. And he tried a lot to push the envelope. And he would do things like asking internal audit to be part of a cultural transformation program. I remember speaking to the CEO of a very big retail company in Australia. I introduced myself and he said, why does internal audit get involved in a cultural transformation program? Before I answered that, he then said, I like your CEO. He thinks differently and he can see the value internal audit would be able to bring in an organization that is going through a transformation, that the culture of internal audit has to be aligned with the culture of organizations. Talking about the embeddedness of internal audit in what you do on a day-to-day basis. I see value in that. The reason I reached up to that organization is they did a fantastic cultural transformation program. And it shows in how the organization is performing today. And if a typical internal auditor hearing you talk about culture in a way that I'm actually smiling right now, would think that there's something wrong. But I see the value of internal audit being embedded and being closer to the business and being part of the culture.
Which is very different from saying, let's take a CPS 220 checklist and tick a few items off.
I would say such things, CPS 220 checklists, Sarbanes-Oxley checklists, whatever it is, checklists are the greatest waste of organizational resources. Just to sit down and plan and say, I'm going to do a checklist to this standard or to meet this standard is not the right way to go. And I know regulators would kill me for saying this. They promote this, but they do a lot of disservice because there is more you get in internal audit functions being involved in the softer things of the organization, in influencing things. If you influence culture, you are likely going to get far better controlled organization than if you just ask them to do specific things that are required in a checklist.
I was going to ask you what made you leave the audit function, but you obviously got a really good role working as a chief risk officer for a fintech. What I am going to ask you instead is, what do you miss most about being in an audit team or working as an audit professional?
My time as an auditor and my time today as a risk professional, I see it as pretty much doing the same thing if you're doing it right. If you see a very big transition between what you do as an auditor and what you do as a risk professional, again, there's something wrong. I would question that. Why is it so different when your mandate is pretty much the same? What I really miss, I don't know, but I still remember the self-imposed pressure as internal auditors. This is one of those things that I don't know whether I would call it, I miss that, but it's one of the things that I find quite intriguing, why we were giving ourselves so much pressure and not giving ourselves time to reflect and think more. At some point, we became a bit too transactional and too focused on statistics. Have I completed these reviews? What percentage have I done? And trying to quantify almost everything. That's one of the things. The other thing as well is what I call forced audience. By the nature of being an internal auditor and regulatory role that you occupy, you are forced to meet certain individuals. And in some cases, the meetings will just happen because you're there and you're expected to have those meetings, like attending audit committees. I miss the engagement like that. One thing that I do miss is you get a lot of young people in internal audit, nurturing young talent, green, enthusiastic, with a lot of energy. That's one of the things that internal audit is gifted with. And if that could be harnessed more, that would be exciting. Auditors have got so much power, more power than risk professionals. The key is, how do you choose to use the power? Another aspect that I miss a lot is the networking aspect of internal audit. Internal auditors are lucky that the IIA presents them with networks. And whilst risk management has got a lot of networks, there's a bit of a difference between risk management networks and internal audit. Internal audit people tend to be more open and share ideas and be more specific. I see in the risk space as more fluff and more trying to look good rather than actually uplifting the profession.
Talking about networks and working with others, if you were still in an internal audit function right now, what would you have done and what would you say your peers would be doing about the impact of the pandemic and the fact that your internal audit plan would probably need to change quite significantly?
The internal audit function would need to be more reflective during this time and reduce the rush to action. At this point in time, in the middle of the pandemic, everyone is trying to swim and stay alive. Being presented with that opportunity or challenge would require a lot of thinking, reflection, and using time wisely. We talk about the role of the board in terms of conformance and in terms of performance. Every internal audit function should look at those two dimensions and assess the environment and say, what can we do in terms of conformance and what can we do in terms of performance? And then overlay with the reality of what COVID is doing to your organization's performance and strategy.
So obviously a lot of conformance work has been the backbone of internal audit plans, internal audit strategies, and performance is something that we need to focus on a lot more. We should be focusing on a lot more, and we need to focus on a lot more going forward. What do you see as the role of the use of data in helping advance that?
If you look at the skill set of internal auditors, the majority would have a background similar to mine. So you get this homogeneous group of people and you're expecting them to do things differently. And you expect them to know the business. You expect them to understand the business. You expect them to be very good communicators and influencers. And you expect them to do everything. They are troubleshooters. That's a challenge. And we will be asking too much of our people, that you select a certain group of people with a certain kind of mindset and you want them to do everything. I would advocate for more diversity in an internal audit function or risk function so that you start to get skills that are reflective of what the organization does. And one of those things would be to do things smarter in a way that reduces operational costs
I've got a particular bugbear at the moment. There's risk associated with bringing financial auditors in and only financial auditors in to do internal audit work, because it's very difficult to move from thinking about one risk to thinking about 50. But that aside, it's important to bring diverse skill sets, diverse experiences into the team to get different perspectives. One of the things that we've been thinking about, though, is what are the base skills that internal auditors should have? And even if you do have specialist data analysts or data scientists, which is important, particularly for the more complex, more difficult data work that needs to take place, one of the things that we've been advocating for a while is that really everybody within the audit team should be able to use data themselves. It's part of the core skill set, and using data doesn't mean that you need to be able to write 1,000 lines of code and use heavy, complex technology. You can use data within Excel spreadsheets. You can use data within visualization tools. You can profile data and do all sorts of things with data. When you think about the full gamut of what it is that we should be doing with data, and the fact that largely in most industries we've moved from paper-based to electronic recording of transactions, etc., every auditor really should have some level of capability in using data themselves.
Definitely, 100% agreed. The analogy for that, if you remember when you didn't have laptops or computers in the office, and if you had to have a letter or a document written, you handwrite it and then you give it to the secretary, who then type it for you, and then you go and review, and then you send the changes to the secretary, and then they'll write it, and then it goes out.
Interestingly, there's still some organizations that do that.
Okay, I don't know where they are, but anyway.
You will be amazed.
Some people still dictate their letters to their secretaries to have them typed up.
There's a lot of wastage there. So if you look at that time and you look at today, you have to do everything. Things that were historically reserved for secretaries to do, everyone has to do it. You have to work on your computer, type up documents. That's a basic skill that had to be learned by a lot of people. And people went through that transition, found it very difficult, especially those who actually started in a very paper-based environment. And there are some suffering from the challenges of that transition, that they cannot function unless something is printed out in hard copy. That's the transition, which I would equate to the need for having skills around data for internal auditors. The skills are not just the technical. They can be just in the mindset. That's where the starting point is, the baseline, that every auditor should be able to think about the use of data in solving business problems. The reason I give value to data is we are in that age where data is available. Businesses that have data are valued more than businesses that do not hold data. And because you've got such an asset, the critical thing is, how do you actually use that asset? And if you're an internal auditor, and in this day and age, you actually do not have inclination to think about the use of data, I don't know what you'll be doing.
So what you're saying is that at the minimum, you need to be able to think about where the potential data sources might be and what it is that you could be using it for to be able to execute on audits. And that's the minimum baseline requirement.
Yes, and I would actually go further to say that you actually need to understand the organizational architecture from processes, systems, structures, people, and all that. You actually need to have a very good view. If I were to go back into internal audit in a smaller organization where I would need to do a quick change, I would spend a lot of time with my team to build the understanding of the organization as a whole. One of the critical elements would come into data, understanding what is it that we hold and where is it. You shouldn't be thinking about data when you start an audit. So you should be an organization or an internal audit function that actually continuously think about data, want to explore data, and be comfortable in it, so that by the time you actually want to solve a business problem, you are not going through a voyage of discovery to find things that can be so frustrating. And by the way, I talked about self-imposed pressure or self-imposed deadlines. Internal auditors put themselves in a trap by saying, I have got to start this piece of work. I'll start by this day, I'll finish by this day, and I'll be measured by that. And then you start to create a lot of metrics around that. If you spend just little time instead of focusing on the process of auditing and what you send out to your stakeholders, and just about the problems that you face as an organization and how you can use data to answer some of those questions, it will be a much better outcome than the process itself.
What you mentioned there reminds me of like the very first audit that I did was with a paper manufacturing company 15 years ago now. But essentially the first thing that we did when we did that audit, and this was a financial audit, mind you, not even an internal audit. The first thing that we did was we went out to the mill and looked at all of the raw materials and where they were being sourced from and where they were going to and how they would be put through various machines to create the paper that was coming out on the other end. And there's a similar, not exactly the same because that was a very specific business process, but particularly today where most of financial services in particular, but most other organizations as well are largely transactions, etc., are data heavy. And so you have data coming in and you have data processing through various applications and ending up somewhere. If you don't understand how the data comes in and you don't understand where it's going through and where it's going to end up, if you don't have a picture of that, it's very hard to actually audit it. Similar to how if we didn't understand what the mill looked like, where the paper came in, where it went through, how it was secured, how the different dyes were applied to it, and how it was actually created an endpoint, we wouldn't actually be able to do any audit work there.
Yes, definitely. Anyone who's involved in reviewing a process needs to see how things work, a feel of that. Firsthand, it has to be contextualized so that by the time you actually start to use your tools to answer those questions, you get perspective and context.
The Assurance Show is produced by Risk Insights. We provide data-focused advice, training, and coaching to internal audit teams and performance audit teams. You can find out more about our work at datainaudit.com. Now, back to the conversation.
You spoke about understanding how things work. And I know within financial services and several other industries, there's been a move away from thinking about things like branch visits. So branch visits became a lower risk item, if you want to call it that, particularly when we think about conformance. But just as an example, if a lot of our customers are visiting the branch or customers are calling into a call center and we don't look at those areas, then are we focusing on conformance risks or are we really understanding how our customers interact with us and what that could mean for reputation, for the way in which we're perceived, for how we provide customer service? Is that coming back? Are we looking more closely at frontline channels and how our customers interact with us, and or should we be doing more of that as auditors?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with the branch audit. I know that in my last role as a CAE, that's one of the things that I celebrated not having to do. And the reason is it was contextual. Where we were in the organization and where the biggest risk resided required me to make that turn. As I reflect and think about these things, even today in my role, there should be a very, very close alignment between what you do as an internal auditor to what the organization stands for. If the strategy in your organization is to include a lot of physical presence, some use technical channels, channels, if the strategy is that they focus on that, then you need to be attuned to that and understand the sources of risks from conformance perspective to performance perspective. It has to be properly balanced. One thing that I would advise any internal auditor looking at today is take your internal audit plan today and check the CEO's KPIs today. Try to marry them. If you cannot marry the CEO's KPIs and your plan, then you should be asking yourself, why is there disconnect between those two? Because the CEO's KPIs are linked to the strategy of the organization. The board wouldn't put his KPIs or her KPIs if they do not believe that those KPIs would drive the strategic outcome. If you are working in tandem or in line with what the board wants, then surely you should be closely aligned with that and you should be able to. So whether you are going to be sitting in branches, in call centers, or understanding the digital interface between your organization and its customers, all that should be a subject of where you are as an organization in terms of your strategic journey.
So, Josam, could I flip that sentiment on its head a little bit and get your views? Every organization has a strategy refresh every 3 years or 5 years, or business objectives are planned for annually. Do you see any role for the insights generated by internal audit to contribute more in that refresh process?
Yes, definitely. The biggest gift an internal audit function should provide would be input to a strategy. And it takes various forms depending on the organization's maturity and where the internal audit is at. A well-executed internal audit plan or strategy would actually inform the strategy on a day-to-day basis. It should help tweak if the strategy is already there, and it should help validate the strategy, and it should be able to give breaks where breaks are required. At CUA, the reason I caught that is I was the CAE, so I had a lot of influence in terms of what internal audit would be able to do, as opposed to my other roles where I looked at one portfolio or just part of a portfolio. In my final year in that organization, we as the function helped the executive and the board to think about how they actually align their ambitions and long-term visions to the reality on the ground by actually spelling out things that needed to be there in place before they can move very fast. Internal audit has got a unique role in spelling out where the organization is at, giving free consultants services to the organization in painting a picture of how they are traveling towards achieving their strategy. And the more the picture is aligned with where the organization would be, the more they are listened to, the more you align your messaging to the messaging or to the tone that you see from your board and from executive management, you will be able to influence a lot. If you are an internal audit function and what you do doesn't find in any way, in any conversations that happen in terms of the strategy, then it shows the level that you're operating at. Somebody said there's no good or bad strategy. The key is execution. And the board will be in a position to say, we know that you've got all these dreams, just like every other organization. But here are the things that we are seeing from internal audit reports that are telling us that you've got some execution problems spelled out in A, B, C, and D. That conversation is a very good conversation that internal audit can influence.
Excellent. Josam, we've run out of time. We'd love to spend a whole lot more time talking to you, and I'm sure we'll get you back on the show at some point in the future to talk about specific items. I know that you are pretty keen on interacting with, helping, and networking with other folk in the risk and audit sphere. How can people get hold of you? What's the best way? If somebody wanted to tap you and say, hey, Josam, can you help me with this? Or can you give me advice on this? What's the best way for them to get hold of you?
LinkedIn works very well for me. I have had very good interactions and friendships from LinkedIn in terms of people reaching out and me reaching out to some individuals. Anytime, just write me a message on LinkedIn. I'll respond pretty quickly.
Excellent. We'll put a link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes.
Yeah, that would be great.
All right. Josam, thank you very much for joining us today.
Lots of great insights there, Josam. Really appreciate it. And there certainly were a few personal takeaways.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure talking to you guys.
Thanks, Josam.
Okay, cheers.
Cheers, Josam. Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please share with a friend and rate us in your podcast app. For immediate notification of new episodes, you can subscribe at assuranceshow.com. The link is in the show notes.